Hey there, deep divers. You know we like to go deep around here, and today we're going deep on chapters 4 and 5
Ooh, chapters 4 and 5.
of Ray Dalio's How Countries Go Broke. I'm a little terrified.
It is a fascinating read.
Yeah, and timely.
Very.
Yeah, we're going to unpack how entire countries can end up in financial ruin, which, sounds like a big macro topic, but
Right.
affects all of us whether we realize it or not.
Absolutely. And what Dalio does so well is he just doesn't, describe these crises as one-offs. He really tries to put a framework around it and the mechanics of it. And believe it or not, there are patterns that repeat through history.
Right. Yeah, he talks about this thing called the big debt cycle,
Yeah.
which sounds pretty ominous. What exactly is
It is a recurring historical sequence where excessive debt ultimately leads to economic instability and sometimes even collapse. And the cycle has distinct phases, and understanding those phases is crucial to recognizing the warning signs before it's too late.
Right, so it's like a financial EKG or something.
Yeah.
Where you can spot those irregular heartbeats
Precisely.
of an economy before things go completely haywire.
Yeah.
So one of the first things that I know Dalio examines is this idea of hard money versus fiat money.
Right.
And how that kind of sets the stage for understanding how these debt cycles can play out.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of remind me of the distinction between hard and fiat currency?
Sure. So hard currency is tied to something tangible, like gold or silver, and its value is directly linked to that underlying asset. Fiat currency, on the other hand, is based on faith in the government that issues it. It's essentially a promise that the currency holds value because the government says so.
So hard currency is like, money with training wheels, and then fiat is like,
yeah.
we're going to just take a leap of faith that the
Take a leap of faith. That's what they're doing.
Exactly. And that leap of faith happened in 1971 when the U.S. abandoned the gold standard.
Right.
I actually remember that day on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and the energy was electric with surprise. Oh, wow. I bet. So essentially now most of the world operates on this fiat currency system.
Correct.
What are some of the implications of that shift?
Well, one is the way that countries handle devaluation. In a hard currency system, devaluation tends to be abrupt, like a sudden shock.
Okay.
But in a fiat currency system, it's more gradual, like a slow erosion of purchasing power. Think of Japan, for example. The policies of the Bank of Japan have led to a gradual devaluation of the yen over an extended period.
So instead of a sudden crash, it's like a slow leak.
Exactly.
Okay. So how does this all tie back into these debt cycles?
Well, to really understand how it plays out, we need to look at Dalio's framework of 9 stages of a final crisis.
Okay.
And these stages kind of represent the typical path he sees a country taking toward a major debt crisis.
Right. So give me the 9 stages. What are we looking at here?
It's kind of a roadmap, but not to a good place. So it starts with debt accumulation, where both the private and government sectors start piling up significant debt burdens. Oftentimes, this is fueled by low interest rates and a booming economy, giving this false sense of security.
Right. It's like that feeling of, getting a new credit card
Right.
and thinking you can just go out and buy
You can buy anything.
whatever you want, but you forget that eventually those bills are going to come due.
Exactly. And that's when stage 2 hits the private sector crisis. Debt bubbles burst, businesses struggle, and everyone's scrambling to deleverage.
Right.
And in a moment of panic, governments often step in with bailouts, which only adds to their own already pretty significant debt load.
Right. So it's just kind of a vicious cycle where you try to solve one problem, but you're just creating another problem down the line. So what is stage 3?
Stage 3 is when the debt squeeze really takes hold. The free market's demand for government debt plummets,
Okay.
forcing governments to offer higher and higher interest rates to attract buyers. They're trying to convince investors to take on more risk, but that only works for so long.
Yeah, this is starting to sound like a very slow motion train wreck
That's a good way to put it.
that we're describing.
Yeah.
So what are some of the signs that a country is maybe heading into stage 4, like that real breaking point?
Well, in stage 4, investor confidence completely evaporates. They start dumping government bonds and other assets, putting downward pressure on the currency. And central banks, they try to defend the currency, but their actions like raising interest rates and selling off their reserves can further weaken the economy and create this doom loop. It's a desperate game of whack-a-mole.
This is giving me financial anxiety just thinking about this.
It's not good.
So if a country gets to this point of crisis, what are the next steps in Dalio's framework?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting, and we'll save that for our next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
But what's crucial to remember is that these first 4 stages aren't inevitable. By understanding how they unfold, we can be more vigilant in spotting the early warning signs, both in our own economies and on the global stage.
Right. It's easy to feel powerless, I think, when you talk about things like national debt and financial crises.
Yeah.
But knowledge is definitely power in this case.
Absolutely.
So if we really want to understand how these crises play out, we need to zoom in on those first 4 stages,
right,
where the seeds of a potential collapse are often sown.
Exactly. And that's where chapters 4 and 5 of Dalio's book get really granular.
Okay, I'm ready to get granular.
Yeah.
Let's unpack those early stages and see if we can spot any red flags in today's economic landscape. Okay, so we're diving deep into chapters 4 and 5.
Yes.
Where Dalio gets into the nitty-gritty of how these crises actually unfold. He focuses on those first 4 stages, right?
He does, and meticulously breaks down the mechanics using real-world examples and even charts to illustrate his point.
Oh, you had me at charts.
So let's talk stage 1, debt accumulation.
Okay.
What are some of those classic signs that a country might be on this slippery slope?
Well, first you see rising government spending, often outpacing revenue growth. This is often coupled with a focus on consumption over investment.
Meaning more money is going toward immediate gratification rather than building for the future.
So it sounds like somebody just, maxing out their credit cards on a shopping spree.
Yeah.
Instead of, investing in their education or starting a business or something.
It's a similar concept on a national scale.
Okay.
And then there's the reliance on social safety nets, which are important, of course, but can become a burden if they're not properly funded or managed.
Okay, so it's kind of a combination of spending beyond your means and not really laying a solid foundation for future growth.
Yeah.
Are there any countries today that are exhibiting these signs?
Unfortunately, yes. Dalio points to the U.S. and Brazil as examples. Both have growing government debt burdens and significant social safety net programs. This can lead to what's called a crowding out effect.
Crowding out? What does that mean?
It's when essential spending like on infrastructure or education gets squeezed out because so much of the budget is going towards servicing the debt. It's like trying to renovate your kitchen while you're still paying off that hefty car loan.
Right, priorities get all jumbled. And you mentioned reliance on foreign lending earlier. How does that play into all of this?
Well, when a country consistently spends more than it brings in, it needs to borrow money to cover the difference.
Right.
This often comes from foreign lenders, which can create a vulnerability. If those lenders lose confidence, they can pull their money out quickly, triggering a financial crisis.
So it's like building your house on somebody else's land.
Exactly.
If they decide to sell, you're in trouble.
Yeah, and Dalio highlights an interesting point about current account deficits.
Okay.
Which means a country is importing more than it's exporting. These deficits aren't always a bad thing.
Okay.
They can actually signal a strong economy attracting foreign investment. But during a crisis, they become a major weakness.
Okay.
Like a once popular restaurant suddenly facing a mass exodus of customers.
Got it. So it's all about context.
Right.
All right, let's move on to stage 2, the private sector crisis. What's happening here?
So this is when those debt bubbles we talked about start to burst. Businesses that are over-leveraged with debt struggle to stay afloat, and that's when governments often feel pressured to step in with bailouts.
Right, like using a Band-Aid to fix a broken bone.
Exactly.
Doesn't really address the root cause.
Right.
And these bailouts just add to the government's own debt, right?
Precisely. Dalio observed a recurring pattern where government debt skyrockets while private debt plunges.
Interesting.
It's a dangerous shift in the balance of risk, pushing the government closer to the edge.
It's almost like the government's absorbing all the private sector's problems.
Right.
Which just doesn't sound sustainable in the long run. What about stage 3, the debt squeeze? How does that play out?
So this is where the demand for government debt falls short of the supply. Investors become wary of a country's ability to repay its debts, and they start demanding higher interest rates for their loans. It's like a bank increasing your mortgage rate because your credit score took a hit.
Ooh, yeah. So the country has to pay more to borrow money, which further strains its finances.
Yeah.
What are some of the red flags at this stage?
One major warning sign is when debt service payments, the money a country has to pay just to cover the interest on its debt, start to consume a huge chunk of its income. Imagine having most of your paycheck going just to pay the minimum on your credit cards.
Oof, that's not good. Do governments ever try to hide these problems?
Some do, resorting to what Dalio calls accounting tricks. These can include things like off-balance sheet financing, where debts are hidden from public view.
Oh, what you're saying.
Or debt guarantees, where the government promises to backstop the debts of private companies, potentially exposing itself to even greater risk.
So it's like sweeping the dust bunnies under the rug and hoping nobody will notice.
Right. but eventually someone's going to trip over them.
Exactly. And Dalio cites countries like Turkey and Brazil as examples of using these tactics in recent years, ultimately delaying the inevitable consequences. Okay, so stage 3 is where things start to feel really precarious. What about stage 4, the breaking point? How does investor panic actually turn into a full-blown crisis?
So stage 4 is when those cracks in the facade become impossible to ignore. Investors sensing danger start selling off a country's assets, from stocks and bonds to real estate and even its currency.
Wow.
This mass exodus puts immense downward pressure on the currency, making it less valuable in the global market.
So it's like a run on the bank, but on a national scale.
Exactly. Everyone wants to get their money out before it's too late.
Right. And central banks often try to step in at this point, right?
They do. They raise interest rates to try to attract foreign investment and sell off their reserves to defend the value of the currency. But these actions can backfire, making the economy even weaker and fueling further panic. It's that doom loop we talked about earlier.
Right. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
Exactly.
You might temporarily suppress the flames, but you're ultimately making the situation worse. So at this point, countries face this critical choice, right?
They do.
Do they continue to defend their currency potentially at the cost of further economic contraction? Or do they allow it to depreciate, risking a surge in inflation? It's a choice between two bad options.
It is. And Dalio makes a very interesting observation.
Okay.
He says that in the face of this dilemma, central banks almost always choose to print more money, what they call quantitative easing, or QE, rather than let interest rates rise to levels that would actually curb borrowing and potentially stabilize the situation.
It's kind of like choosing the lesser of two evils, even though both options have pretty serious consequences. What's the rationale behind that decision?
It's complex, but often the fear is that allowing interest rates to rise dramatically would choke off economic activity and lead to a deep recession. Printing money, while risky, can provide a short-term boost and avoid the immediate pain of a sharp economic contraction.
But wouldn't printing more money just lead to inflation down the line?
It certainly can, and that's one of the big risks associated with QE.
Right.
Central banks are trying to walk a tightrope, balancing the need to stimulate the economy with the danger of eroding the value of their currency.
Sounds like a very difficult high-stakes balancing act.
Right.
So I'm guessing this is where those final 5 stages of Dalio's framework come into play.
Right.
Where we see the real consequences of these difficult choices.
Exactly. Those later stages are all about grappling with the fallout of those early missteps and trying to navigate a path back to stability.
All right. So we've covered those first 4 stages where the seeds of crisis are often sown. We've seen how excessive debt policy missteps, a loss of investor confidence can all create kind of a perfect storm for a financial meltdown.
And while it can seem daunting, understanding these patterns is the first step in recognizing the warning signs and hopefully taking action to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past.
Well said. Now I'm ready to delve into those final 5 stages and see what lessons we can learn from countries that have faced these challenges head on. What do you say? Ready for part 3 of our deep dive?
Absolutely. Let's see what happens when those dominoes really start to fall.
Yeah. Okay, deep divers, we're back and ready to tackle those final 5 stages of Dalio's framework for how countries go broke. I'm not going to lie, after going deep on those first 4 stages, I'm a little nervous to see where this all leads. It sounds like things are about to get really messy.
Yeah, it's true that these final stages represent the heart of the crisis, where those early missteps really start to have consequences. But it's not all doom and gloom. You know, there are also valuable lessons to be learned about how countries navigate these turbulent waters and ultimately find their way back to stability.
Okay, that's reassuring.
Yeah.
So let's pick up where we left off. Stage 5 is printing money, which kind of sounds like a recipe for disaster, like just create more money out of thin air to pay off your debts. Is that really a viable strategy?
It can be a very dangerous strategy if it's not carefully managed. Remember, at this point, a country is in a bind. Interest rates are already low, often near zero, and those traditional monetary policy tools are no longer effective. So central banks might resort to creating more money and using it to buy government bonds, hoping to keep those long-term interest rates down and stimulate the economy.
So it's like giving the economy a shot of adrenaline, but with potential side effects down the line.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act. The goal is to stimulate growth without triggering runaway inflation. Too much new money flooding the system can erode the value of the currency and lead to a spiral of rising prices.
Right. Too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. So how do central banks try to manage that risk?
It's all about finding the right dosage and timing. They need to inject enough money to stimulate demand, but not so much that it creates a hyperinflationary environment. It's like trying to keep a balloon afloat without letting it burst.
Okay, I can see that. But what happens if they get it wrong? What are the consequences of overdoing it?
Well, that's when we move into stage 6, which Dalio calls central bank bankruptcy.
Wait, central banks? Now, that sounds terrifying. I thought central banks were supposed to be like the rock-solid foundation of the financial system.
In theory, yes, but they're not immune to the laws of economics. If a central bank keeps printing money to cover losses and prop up a failing economy, they risk undermining trust in the currency and triggering that downward spiral. It's like a doctor who keeps prescribing stronger and stronger medication without addressing the underlying illness. Eventually, the patient's body becomes resistant and the treatment stops working.
So it's a loss of credibility, a sense that the central bank has lost control. That sounds like a recipe for chaos.
It certainly can be, and this is often where those extraordinary measures we discussed earlier come into play. Governments might implement capital controls to prevent money from fleeing the country, or impose special taxes to try to generate revenue quickly. They're essentially trying to triage a dire situation, but those measures often come with their own set of unintended consequences.
It's like putting a tourniquet on a wound. It might stop the bleeding in the short term, but it doesn't address the underlying injury. So if a country reaches this point, what options are even left? Is there any way back from the brink?
That's where stages 7 and 8 come in. Stage 7 is all about restructuring and devaluation. Debts have to be renegotiated, often with creditors agreeing to accept less than they're owed, and the currency's value is likely to take a significant hit, making imports more expensive and potentially fueling inflation.
So it's a painful reset, a recognition that the old way of doing things is no longer sustainable. And what about stage 8, those extraordinary measures? What do those look like in practice?
Think of it as a combination of crisis management and long-term reform. Governments might implement policies to encourage saving and investment, restructure their financial systems, even create a new, more stable currency. It's a process of rebuilding trust and laying the foundation for a more sustainable economic future.
It sounds like a long and arduous journey, but with the potential for a brighter future on the other side.
And that brings us to stage 9, the final stage of Dalio's framework, return to equilibrium. What does that look like? Ideally, this is where debt burdens have been reduced to manageable levels. A stable currency is in place, and the economy is on a path to sustainable growth. It's a return to health, but it often comes at a cost. There may have been significant economic pain along the way, perhaps a period of high inflation or a deep recession.
So it's a recovery, but with scars, a reminder of the risks of financial instability.
Precisely. But it's also a testament to the resilience of economies and the ability of nations to adapt and learn from their mistakes.
That's an important message. It's easy to get caught up in the doom and gloom of financial crises, but there's always hope for recovery and renewal. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Dalio's framework, what are some of the key takeaways you want our listeners to remember?
Well, I think the most crucial lesson is that these crises aren't random events. They often follow predictable patterns driven by excessive debt policy missteps and a loss of confidence. By understanding these patterns, we can all be more vigilant in spotting the warning signs and hopefully avoid repeating those mistakes of the past.
That's a powerful message and a reminder that we all have a role to play in ensuring a more stable and sustainable financial future. I have to say, this deep dive into how countries go broke has been both fascinating and a little bit sobering.
It's certainly a topic that deserves our attention. By understanding the mechanics of these crises, we can empower ourselves to make more informed decisions, both financially and politically.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this complex and thought-provoking topic. I know I've learned a lot, and I hope our listeners have too.
It's been my pleasure. Remember, knowledge is power. And even in the face of economic uncertainty, there's always hope for a brighter future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And to all our listeners out there, stay curious, stay informed, and as always, happy deep diving